Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Colleen Cassady St. Clair to our speaker series. Colleen began her graduate work on penguins and then studied puffins and forest birds as a postdoc. Since 1998, she's been a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alberta. Her research has been focused on animal behavior, and in particular on how animals move through landscapes dominated by people. Besides advancing scientific knowledge, Colleen and her students work to apply research to real-world wildlife problems. And if you are a reader of Nature Alberta magazine, and I hope that you all are, you'll be missing out if you're not. If you are a reader, you will have seen an article by Colleen in the fall issue on research and conservation efforts to reduce grizzly bear mortality from train strikes in Banff and the other mountain parks. So today, Colleen's going to speak to us about something I think we're all familiar with, and that's coyotes in urban areas. She will share her lab's research findings over the past, I think it's almost a decade now, and provide some insights into how coyotes and humans can coexist. So with that, I will turn it over to Colleen, and welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Rick. And thank you all for inviting me along tonight. It's so fun looking at this Zoom screen full of names of friends and people I've known over the years, and seeing some of your faces and your great photos. And it almost feels like we're all in a room together, and that's such a nice feeling. So thank you for coming tonight. And thank you for the invitation to do this. Let me just check that you can see this screen, and then do my sneaky extra screen thing on the side here that you can't see, and check with you. Can you see just one screen with a coyote in the middle of a picture here? Yeah, great. Okay. Takes a moment to set everything up here so that I can see it the way I want to. Well, Rick acknowledged that I grew up here in Alberta. Maybe he didn't say that part. I grew up here in Alberta and did my undergraduate degree here at the University of Alberta, where I am now. I went away and studied elsewhere for about 8 years, and then I was lucky enough to come back to Alberta in the job that I hold now in the Department of Biological Sciences. So that vantage, having lived in Alberta for a long time and then away for a while and then returning, has been formative in the kinds of things that I study in my group. So in a nutshell, what I try to do is integrate the study of animal behavior, which is where I worked in my graduate training on penguins, with the more pressing and urgent issues of conservation biology and wildlife management. And I started out, as Rick acknowledged, doing that in some pretty remote places, seabird islands that in some cases were ecological reserves that people can't go to as tourists or live there, or even as recreationists. But I really had the feeling while I worked there that there were some pressing problems to be solved, some of which involved animal behavior. So I started working on the problem of habitat fragmentation, doing that initially in sort of agricultural landscapes and forested landscapes in the mountain parks, and focusing on how it is that animals manage to move through these landscapes that are dominated by people, and how they select habitat there, and how they manage to persist. I became more and more interested in urban landscapes because of how often it seemed to be the case that animals are actually really good at managing to live alongside humans, and can do so even in urban areas. So I find that fascinating, how they manage the amount of adaptability, behavioral flexibility needed to coexist in these human-dominated landscapes. And in urban areas, as everyone's aware, there's a kind of a range of species that occur in urban areas, and they've been classified usefully, starting with birds a couple of decades ago, 30 years ago, I guess. Contrasting the birds that avoid urban areas and can't cope very well with human infrastructure and noise and habitat change, through to adapters that are pretty good at living with humans, but they stay in check. Their populations don't become really invasive, through to exploiting species of these urban species that are really quite good at taking advantages of humans, so good, in fact, that they do better in human-dominated landscapes, including urban areas. So this continuum applies not just to birds, but really to all wildlife. And what I noticed is that for wildlife that are large or carnivorous, if they are good at adapting to living with humans, usually another thing happens next, some kind of conflict. And we humans define human-wildlife conflict kind of conveniently for ourselves as being situations where wildlife cause us some kind of inconvenience. It might be loss of livelihood, it might be threats to physical safety or the security of pets or livestock or children. So when carnivores particularly manage to adapt and exploit people, human-wildlife conflict always seems to result in these landscapes. And I became more and more interested in how to address that and solve it. So these are all species that we've studied in my lab. And the one I'm going to talk about tonight is, maybe it's my favorite because these guys are just so adaptable, coyotes. So you probably know already that coyotes have expanded their range in North America across the last couple of 100 years or so. They've been moving steadily northwards, westward, eastward, and southwards. They've just recently crossed the Panama Canal, and now they are expanding in Central America, and they will soon be increasing, I think, in South America. So really, cities across the continent have now a phenomenon of urban coyotes that are a fairly recent problem for people to contend with on the human-wildlife conflict stage. So urban coyotes live now in locations ranging from Mexico City to Vancouver to Yellowknife to Halifax and everywhere in between. This is the context that was occurring when I began the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project 12 years ago, I guess it is. And this is a collaborative project that I began with the city of Edmonton, and another important partner is Animal Damage Control. And we set out to try to get a better understanding of coyotes in the Edmonton area. And with that knowledge, we hope that we could provide information to managers and citizens that would make it easier to coexist with coyotes. Before I tell you more about what we did, I want to introduce some of the really important people in this study. This is by no means all of them, but these are the really key ones. Bill Abercrombie and his crew did all of our coyote captures for us in the years that we captured coyotes and put GPS collars on them. He did that as a volunteer service. Maureen Marie was my first PhD student on the project who did wonderful foundational work that we are still using today. More recent students, Scott Sugden and Deanna Steckler, finished master's degrees recently, and I'll tell you a little bit about their work. Current master's students are Cassie Stevenson, Gabrielle Lajeunesse, and Sage Raymond. I'll tell you a little bit about each of their projects as well. An undergraduate student, Jonathan Farr, has been working with our reporting database, and two more colleagues, Howie Harshaw and Catherine Shire, have been involved in many aspects of this project as well. So way back in 2009, Maureen, Bill, and I set out to equip her GPS collar-based study with some questions that we thought would address that broader goal that I just mentioned. And in particular, we wanted to study coyote habitat selection, diet, and condition, all things that were already known in the literature to be potential contributors to conflict between people and coyotes. And the reason these were known to be sources of potential conflict is because these all have to do with how coyotes gain resources in urban areas and whether they might be in particular need for those resources. So we wanted to know how exactly those things contribute to conflict. And if we could understand that, then we wanted to know how could they be mitigated. And some of the solutions are obvious ones that you know about already, containing garbage, for example, and putting dogs on leashes. But some of them might surprise you, like the need to wear rubber gloves or some kind of gloves when you're gardening, and the wonderful utility of tennis balls wrapped with flagging tape. So those are coming later. We started out with pretty conventional methods. This is Maureen and Bill's nephew Joe collaring a coyote. We used physical restraint to do that. We put on them, fitted onto them GPS collars. This one made by Low-Tech, quite a large collar. And the coyotes wore these for varying lengths of time, ranging from a few weeks if they managed to get rid of them quickly to a few years in some cases. And with our first few coyotes that we collared and captured and collared in that order, we noticed an interesting pattern associated with compost. So we targeted some large industrial compost heaps as capture sites because city managers told us that we were likely to find coyotes there. They already knew that coyotes made a lot of use of compost sites, and this is something that Bill Abercrombie knew as well. The pattern that we noticed is that when we caught coyotes at capture sites, we discovered that they often had sarcoptic mange. Mange is a skin parasite that infects their skin. It's tremendously itchy, causes them to scratch at their fur so vigorously that they scratch their own fur out and end up with these sort of bald lesions like this. This scabies mite that causes sarcoptic mange is widespread around the world. About 100 different species of mammals get this mite, but what is known about it, or suspected at least, is that animals are more susceptible to mange when they have poor body condition or low health. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment here to ask you, Ellie. Oh, it's gone now. Your hand was up, so I just wanted to make sure you could hear me all right, or check that there wasn't some kind of problem. But I see your hand is gone now, so hearing nothing, I'll just keep going. So we noticed this pattern in the coyotes that were captured at compost areas sometimes had mange, and the ones that we captured deep in the river valley generally did not. The next thing we noticed came from the results of those GPS collars. So these are maps of Edmonton that show you two important features of Edmonton. It has this huge river valley and ravine system depicted here in green. If you live in Edmonton, you know about that already. And what I'm showing you with these colors are dots indicating individual locations where a GPS collar took a fixed point, and little polygons that show how we mapped the home range of the animal that belonged to that particular kind of dot. What you can see is a difference between the healthy coyotes and the diseased ones. The healthy coyotes had home ranges that were contained in size, concentrated in the river valley and ravine system, and overlapped somewhat, but with the appearance of what appeared to be territories, as expected. But the coyotes that had mange had completely different movement patterns. Their home ranges were 10 times larger than the healthy coyotes, and they had considerable overlap among them. And these coyotes made extensive use of these gray areas, which are some kind of residential, or in these cases, dark gray industrial areas. And they did that especially during the day. So very different styles of urban habitat use. Another thing we found out about these coyotes was something about how they used residential backyards. So this is an example of a cluster of points from a GPS collar, 3 hours apart, showing this coyote spent a lot of time in this backyard in North Edmonton. And then we could go and look at those yards from a respectful distance, and we could determine whether they had things like available compost or other kinds of food availability for the coyotes. And with owner permission, we could determine whether coyotes were actually crawling underneath dwellings and using the heat sources there. And we compared these fixed points to available ones that we generated randomly, and we saw a big difference again between the healthy and the diseased coyotes. The healthy coyotes made use of yards that had some kind of food resources, a little more than would be expected from what was available on average. And no difference really in their use of yards with or without availability of shelter. But that was totally different for the diseased coyotes. In other words, the diseased coyotes really seem to be quite reliant on residential yards. These are backyards of people where they were finding food or shelter under houses. And you'll see later why I think that having diseased coyotes in your backyard is not a good thing. But first, I want to tell you more about the suspicion we had around compost. So we were surprised to learn that coyotes eat a lot of compost. And they do that especially in the winter when presumably other kinds of food are hard to get at. They actually dig in frozen compost and eat it. And one of the undergrads in my lab suggested that the reason they might be doing this could be to obtain food, but it could have a consequence of exposing them to mycotoxins, which I'd never heard of. Mycotoxins are just the byproducts of metabolism of fungi. So in other words, they're the smelly gunk that goes with the mold in your fridge of leftovers you've left a little too long. I saw a couple of you exchange a knowing glance there. Okay, this study did change my relationship with leftovers in the fridge. I no longer eat them if they don't initially make me sick. I just follow Canada Food Guide and throw out leftovers after the requisite number of days because they grow mycotoxins. And this is what we found in the compost samples we took of 3 different mycotoxins that are regulated in animal feed in Canada because they're known to degrade animal immune systems. So these dashed lines give the federal limits of the amount of mycotoxins that are permissible in animal feed. These berries, a blueberry, a cherry, a strawberry, show how much of that mycotoxin you'd need to eat in a daily way to reach these unsafe limits. And these bars show how much was in the compost we sampled. In other words, it's well over the permissible limit for animal feed and would be expected to degrade the immune systems of the animals that are eating this. Well, if that wasn't bad news enough, we also sampled at compost sites and compared it to natural sites in the river valley scats that we collected from coyotes. So we looked in the scats using fecal flotation, a standard technique, for eggs of tapeworms. And we found that the scats from compost areas had 10 times as many tapeworm eggs as the scats from natural areas. So coyotes going to compost areas are eating food that makes them sick, and they have 10 times more tapeworm parasites. Well, that story gets a little bit more complicated because they didn't just have any old parasite. The most prevalent parasite when we necropsied coyotes that had been provided to us by the city after being hit on roads. So these were road-killed coyotes that the city gave to us, and I in turn gave to Mike Stock at MacEwan University, a parasitologist. What he and some undergrads found is the most prevalent kind of tapeworm in the intestine of these coyotes was this one, Echinococcus multilocularis. Now, later, we did a larger sample with more coyotes, and this was published by my colleague Lean Long, another parasitologist, to find that the prevalence of these coyotes, of this parasite in these coyotes, is about 65% in Edmonton. And that's quite a high rate. The reason that is kind of concerning is because in the last 10 years, there's been the arrival of a new strain of this parasite that comes from Europe originally. It's the European strain of Echinococcus multilocularis, but it has since mutated in Canada to become a North American variant of the European strain of Echinococcus multilocularis. And it seems to be much more virulent for people than is the old North American strain that's been in North America for hundreds or thousands of years. And so just since it was first discovered in BC in a dog in 2009, this new strain, it's now been diagnosed in Alberta in a total here of now 20 humans. That is far more than has been discovered anywhere else in North America. So we seem to be here in Alberta and around Edmonton in particular, kind of a hotbed for this parasite. The prevalence in coyotes is high, and there's an absolutely unprecedented rate of diagnosis of this parasite in people. Now, it is treatable. That's the good news. The bad news is it can take 5 to 15 years to become symptomatic. And if you put that together with the discovery in 2009, it means we don't really know yet how many people have been infected with this parasite, because some of the people who have been infected haven't had any symptoms. When you do have symptoms, it seems to act sort of like liver disease. And this patient was believed to have, this lady Cassady Armstrong was believed to have liver cancer. And so she got this wonderful surprise: you don't have liver cancer. you have a potentially fatal parasite that we can treat. Now, this parasite is trophically transmitted. Uh-oh, bad manners. Apologies that I didn't turn that off. I'm doing it right now. Nobody ever calls me, so I don't always remember to turn that off. So it's trophically transmitted. Coyotes pass it in their feces. The eggs are in their feces. The eggs are eaten by things that are eating vegetation on the ground, like mice and voles. They develop cysts in their liver, just as humans do. This is a scan of a human liver showing these cysts. But humans are incompetent hosts. What the coyotes are really targeting are mice and voles. And it's just accidental that we're targeted. So we became pretty interested in this parasite. We wanted to study it in more detail, and Scott and Deanna did that. So they used a bunch more carcasses, more that we collected from the city, from roadkill, a few from conflict that had to be lethally managed because of conflict with people, and several that were legally trapped as part of a population reduction requested by the city of Leduc. They performed necropsies on these coyotes, and they examined the coyotes for their size, their condition, their age via tooth rings, and they measured condition with kidney fat and spleen mass. And then Deanna looked very carefully at stomach contents, and she also counted worms in the intestines of these coyotes using this particular technique to extract the worms from the intestines. And then she divided these stomach contents into all these different types and counted them up for their prevalence and also their volume in the stomachs. So I'm going to show you a few slides now describing these results. And these look kind of intimidating with a bunch of graphs, but they're not really, and they're pretty interesting. This graph shows 5 different things. First of all, it shows that this parasite, Echinococcus multilocularis, is 50% more prevalent in urban coyotes than it is in rural coyotes. Second, it shows that coyotes living in urban areas in purple are eating more anthropogenic food and less prey. And that is true whether it's measured by the proportion or the percentage of those items in their stomachs, or whether it was measured as volume. And we also measured stable isotopes from claw samples from these coyotes to get an estimate of their long-term diet. And that's done conventionally with isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. Carbon signaling access to processed food, which contains corn, a plant that has a particular photosynthetic pathway that shows up in this isotope. So these points way out to the right are showing higher processed food consumption measured by corn because it's in virtually all processed foods. And this axis, nitrogen, is showing protein consumption, and you can see that the highest protein consumers were the rural animals. And now in this final graph, if you would look at condition, you can see that the kidney fat index is lower, the spleen mass is higher, and the overall health score of the urban coyotes is lower. The urban coyotes on average were in poorer condition. So what Scott did was take this a step further and look molecularly at the microbiome of the coyotes. So just like us, coyotes have a bunch of microbes living in their guts. And just like us, those microbes help them digest their food and mediate their immune systems. And there's thousands of species of microbes living in their gut as well as ours. Our human microbiome has been described as the most complex ecosystem on Earth. What we know from humans and other animals is that microbiomes as ecosystems can become disrupted and kind of dysfunctional. So Scott was looking for evidence of that. And this is a graph that shows just in 2-dimensional space whether or not the rural and urban coyotes had different microbiomes. And you can see there's a little bit of difference here, but they're largely overlapping. What is apparent though, if you measure these ellipses, is that this purple one is bigger. So the urban coyotes have a broader diet breadth than the rural coyotes do, and that's something we've seen in previous studies. An interesting thing about these specific microbiome taxa that Scott found is that when he looked at the health of the coyotes, he could correlate that to the presence of certain types of bacteria. In particular, these healthy coyotes had higher levels of fusobacteria in the rural areas. And that's a bacterium that's associated with, or group of bacteria associated with protein digestion. And he found that in the less healthy urban coyotes, they had a higher proportion of lactic acid bacteria, which are associated with carbohydrate digestion, which is indicative that these animals are eating more of things like fruit and compost and bird seed and so on. So what to make of this? Well, one of the things that CBC made of it is they're really good at finding the one sentence in your discussion that says, you know, based on what we know of dogs, this could change the behavior of coyotes as well as their digestion and health. And they put out this story suggesting that eating garbage could be associated with more aggressive behavior in urban coyotes. And I think that is quite possible, but I want to emphasize that our study of it was correlative, not causative. Nonetheless, it was really amazing, some of the things we pulled out of the stomachs of the urban coyotes. And this is one example that I happened to participate in. You know those Rona work gloves that are sort of gray and blue? Maybe you have some in your garage. They're really like coarse, hard leather. Well, this is part of one of those gloves that we pulled out of the stomach of a coyote. This is a Tim Hortons muffin wrapper. These are a couple of bird feathers. These are probably deer mice feet. This is an apple, a domestic apple. This is a grape stem. These are probably chokecherry pits. This is likely a pocket gopher claw, and this is an apple seed. So you can see here a real mix of food quality, all of it pretty opportunistic, and a real mix of natural and anthropogenic food types. So Deanna looked really carefully at the food. What she wanted to know is whether there was a link between the contents of the stomachs and the infection with Echinococcus. Is it the case, for example, that the coyotes that are eating more garbage are more likely to be infected with this tapeworm that people can get? She didn't find very strong signals of this, lots of variation. She did see that urban coyotes in red ate more rodents. And remember, rodents are the intermediate host. She also saw that they ate more indigestible anthropogenic food like that glove, but less digestible anthropogenic food like tasty bits of garbage. And she also found that the single best predictor of whether or not the animals had Echinococcus was not diet at all, it was age. Young age was the strongest predictor of Echinococcus infection. And that was true whether she detected it with molecular methods and DNA, or whether she detected it by looking for worms under a microscope. So young coyotes are more likely to be infected, but the story is even more complicated. Note here that I said these urban coyotes also eat more rodents. Well, what we found when we looked at these variables as interactions is something really unexpected. So this graph shows rodents in the stomach. More rodents, more infection, you would think, since rodents are the intermediate hosts. Yes, that's true for young coyotes, but it's not true for old coyotes. For old coyotes, the more rodents they eat, the less likely they were to be infected. There was a perfect interaction between age and rodent consumption, suggesting that rodent consumption is predictive of infection for young coyotes, but not old coyotes, suggesting that older coyotes develop immunity to this tapeworm. And that has been found actually in foxes in the wild, and it's also been found with veterinary studies for dogs in captivity. So it's a phenomenon known to exist, and here's some evidence that it might exist in coyotes. And I think that has really big implications for culling programs that make a younger age distribution necessarily. So I'm saying that younger coyotes are more likely to be infected with this parasite that can be transmitted to people, and culling programs make more young coyotes. Okay, what else about conflict? Well, I want to return to some older work done by Maureen, again using this technique of stable isotopes, because she also showed this higher concentration of processed food with this high carbon signature, but this time not in urban versus rural. She showed it in the urban animals involved in conflict. These are the guys that were removed because they were doing something like really egregious. They wouldn't leave somebody's backyard, or they ate a dog or something like that. And the coyotes in the urban sample that weren't involved in conflict ate less processed food and more protein. So returning now to this possibility that the microbiome might become disrupted and cause conflict, here's a alluring for me anecdote. 4 years ago, almost to the day, a very large dog, a Bernese mountain dog, was killed in Edmonton by what's believed to have been a single large male coyote. It happened about 30 meters from somebody's back door with an off-leash dog. And this dog would have outweighed the coyote by about 3 times. So that is very bold behavior. The coyote was lethally removed. We received its carcass. We analyzed it as part of that sample. And do you remember that I told you that fusobacteria was associated with protein digestion? This coyote had no fusobacteria in its gut, none. It was the only coyote in our sample to have no fusobacteria in its gut. And do you remember that I told you that its absence was associated with aggressive behavior in dogs? So it's a bit of a smoking gun, and one I hope we'll be able to study more in future. But let me switch gears a little bit now and tell you about coyote sightings that are provided by members of the public like you. I actually know that some of the people on the screen tonight have contributed data to this, so thank you very much for doing that. We have about 10, oops, I've got a typo there. It's about 10,000 reports on the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project website now, where people can report a coyote. They can zoom in on this map. They can report exactly where the coyote was with the date and the time. And if they want, they can provide some comments about the behavior of that coyote. Jonathan Farr rather, is working up these data, and he found a really interesting pattern that we've kind of been suspecting just from anecdotal reports from people and from my own observations and interactions with coyotes and from news reports across the continent, that the boldness of coyote behavior measured here in avoidance, neutral, or approach behaviors has been increasing gradually over time. And it's highest in general during the pup rearing period in summer when coyotes are defending den sites containing pups. And negative comments about coyotes are variable through time, but they are more common when the comment also acknowledges the presence or concern for children or dogs or cats. And that's really not surprising that people are worried about aggressive coyotes if they also are aware of vulnerable individuals. So this awareness about urban coyotes has been increasing across the continent, partly because there's been some really alarming news stories that travel far and wide when they occur, such as these ones. So in 2018, this little guy was attacked by a coyote, needing many stitches to his head, when he was playing on his own driveway of his home in Burnaby. And we had a case in Aurora, Ontario, captured by this family's own security system camera. They returned from a birthday party, the children rush into the yard, and a coyote comes from the lane area behind them and knocks down this little girl. Luckily, she wasn't hurt. A toddler here in Edmonton in 2020 in Coronation Park was knocked down and bitten by a coyote, also needing stitches. So these events are still extremely rare, but they seem to be more prevalent than they used to be. That trend has been going on for years. And last year, the doors just fell off. Last year, unprecedented things happened in both Vancouver and Calgary. In Vancouver, there were 45 attacks by coyotes on people where people were bitten. Actually, the Vancouver authorities think the number is higher than that, and many people didn't report because of their concern for coyotes or concern for the activities they were doing at the time. 8 people were bitten by coyotes in Calgary, also absolutely unprecedented. So quite justifiably, many people have a lot of concern about aggressive coyotes in urban areas. And it's not only for people, it's also for pets. So this situation is happening more frequently than it used to. I hear of several of these examples each year where somebody has a pet in a yard that is then attacked by a coyote. And I'm not sure why I'm not seeing my, oh, there we go. And it's surprisingly easy for coyotes to get into yards with low fences like this one in Sherwood Park, backing on an agricultural field where this Chihuahua was taken from his backyard. So folks will have to get used to the fact that this is not an adequate fence to keep a coyote out of an urban yard. Quite a few small dogs have been taken this way. Large dogs more often are attacked when they're walking with their owners, especially during denning season when the pups are in dens. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But first I want to acknowledge that another thing that happens with coyotes and pets is that I think some coyotes learn to target cats that are at large. So Edmonton, like many cities, has a bylaw against cats being at large, but there's still a lot of cats at large. There's also a fairly recent phenomenon of feeding and sheltering feral cats. And nobody really knows how much of this is going on. It's not in any way regulated or monitored, but all of us know of neighbors that have feral cats, and it's quite a lovely intention I think people have to shelter animals without a home. But it has implications, as always these things do. So we wrote a paper a couple of years ago with Nick Nation, a veterinary pathologist, about this phenomenon of these dismembered cats that were showing up on people's porches, with many members of the public convinced that the reason for that could only be that some kind of horrible psychopathic lunatic lived in their neighborhood who liked to sever cats and then deposit them on people's porches. Well, Nick is an expert at examining animal corpses to determine what the cause of death was, and he invited me to review these with him, which I did only with photographs, but it was fascinating. And we agreed that every single cat showed evidence of coyote predation or scavenging. And one of the telltale signs were these little tufts of coyote fur in the often splintered claws of the cats, which is what the cat was doing in its last moment. And this is a photo that Cassie Stevenson captured on a remote camera of a coyote carrying a cat, and one of our remote camera sites here in Edmonton. So the reason I think there are these occasional spikes in cat mortalities being reported by the public is that coyotes sometimes learn to target cats. They learn where they are abundant and they go there to hunt them. So that's another thing that could attract coyotes to residential areas to prey on animals. So for the last few minutes here of this talk, what I'd like to do is address this question. I've shown you a bunch of things that lead to conflict with coyotes. And now what I'd like to do is tell you kind of a general conceptual model we have for what is likely to really increase rates of conflict with coyotes, and then to suggest some solutions of how we could avoid this conflict. So the model that I worked up with Maureen years ago is that when coyotes stay in natural habitat, the river valley and ravines, eating natural diets of rodents mostly, and rabbits, snowshoe hares in the ravines, maybe some jackrabbits out in open areas, they have a pretty copacetic life that doesn't cause much conflict. But as they move to a diet that includes more anthropogenic foods and a habitat that includes more anthropogenic features, as they move into residential areas and eat more and more human-sourced foods, they enter a feedback loop that tends to cause them to get into conflict, and once there, stay there. And we think this is often mediated by parasites and other kinds of condition-mediated problems. So it might not only be parasites, it also might be poor body condition and starving animals. So if we want to keep our coyotes in these areas, there's some things we would need to do. First of all, prevent them from accessing human sources of food. And I'll show you in a moment how that is more complex than it seems. We want to prevent human exposure to parasites, particularly this tapeworm. We want to discourage coyotes from using residential areas, and especially to discourage them from denning in residential areas. and we want to be able to protect pets from coyotes and at the same time control pets to avoid kind of inducing coyotes to attack. So let me go over these one at a time to explain why they're maybe a little bit more complicated than it may at first seem. So first of all, food. I've mentioned that coyotes are really attracted to compost, but it's not a high quality food for them, as I've shown you. It's a sort of a desperation food. They eat the compost if they're desperate, but what also attracts them to compost, of course, is the mice that are attracted to compost. So anything else that would eat compost and would congregate near compost is also going to attract coyotes. Any kind of litter in natural areas that's associated with things ranging from bush parties to overflowing trash containers, perhaps including encampments, these things will also attract coyotes and condition them to associating humans with food. Garbage, of course, attracts coyotes. Edmonton has a new bin system, and one of the people on tonight, Jim Broman, has done a great job of pointing out that our new bin system has dramatically reduced the number of instances he's witnessed of garbage that's been spread around by coyotes. But there's also some things that people don't realize attract coyotes, such as birdseed that spills from feeders or is purposefully deposited on the ground, and fallen fruit. We find a tremendous amount of fallen fruit in coyote diet. And a few people have shown me over the years pictures of coyotes actually climbing trees, crabapples usually, to eat fruit. Well, it's easier said than done, as I acknowledged, partly because there's so many sources of these kinds of food subsidies. All over Edmonton's River Valley, it's become common for people to hang bird feeders, which sometimes other people dump out. And so the seeds all over the ground. But even without that kind of action, birds are just kind of messy with bird feeders. So this is tremendously increasing the rodent population at the sites of these feeders, which are invariably along trails. And an increased rodent population is going to increase attraction by coyotes, but it's also going to increase this cycle of coyote rodent Echinococcus transmission. And many people don't know that rodents are the host for the early nymphal stages of the Lyme disease tick. So there's a bunch of reasons we really do not want to be congregating rodents beside our trails in the river valley. Many people are surprised to know how attracted coyotes are to fruit, and also how deterred they can be by banging on the window. I don't know if you could hear the window banging, but that's what caused that coyote to take off, and you can see it had no trouble with that 5-foot fence. So I was delighted when Edmonton passed a bylaw last year to prohibit wildlife feeding. That's something I've been advocating for many years now. Guided in part by you, Steve Herrero. You're on here, I know, and you taught me a lot about food conditioning many years ago that I've never forgotten. Okay, the next thing that I think we need to be more attentive to is parasites. And parasites are of many forms, of course, but the one that we're worried about is this tapeworm. And the places we're worried about it are places where people would be handling the soil, such as the 3 community gardens on South Campus run by volunteers, where there is a very high concentration of coyotes and positive scats with this parasite. So gardeners should know, and I've tried to make sure I've alerted all the folks at these gardens to wear gloves, to avoid stopping for lunch and eating their sandwich with the same hand that's been digging in the soil. But the other group that might need to be a little bit more careful and aware are dog owners, especially if your dog eats rodents, as some dogs do, because then your dog can be a definitive host for this parasite. And when it poops out its poop in the backyard, it can be pooping out these eggs. If you have this suspicion for your dog, it's easy to treat dogs against this parasite with a once a month anti-parasitic drug. But of course, the scats that are left by infected coyotes or dogs can shed these eggs. They can last in the environment, I think I mentioned earlier, for a long time, up to a year has been the studies in Europe, even at very cold temperatures. And then if your dog or your child is rolling around on the grass and then rolling around on the bed, and especially if they're doing that together, it's easy to imagine you could accidentally eat some of these eggs. So a veterinarian at the University of Saskatchewan, Emily Jenkins, reassures me that you probably would have to eat a lot of eggs to become infected with this parasite. But I would just say, better safe than sorry. All right, the next thing that I'd really like to see more effort towards is discouraging coyotes from denning in residential areas. And at first, people tend to find this cute. It's kind of like raccoons. They really like them at first, and they really don't like them after that. And this is one of the reasons we did the backyard paper a few years ago, to show people what it is that attracts coyotes to backyards. And the number one thing is cover, shelter. The number two thing is human food, then fruit trees, then prey. And of course, they're more attracted where there isn't a fence. But a fence won't necessarily keep coyotes out. This is a yard in St. Albert, a bedroom community of Edmonton. This is a little 3-season room attached to the main house in this yard next door to this one with this big spruce tree. But this is how a skinny female coyote that did not seem to have a mate entered this yard. She came behind this spruce tree, between this fence and this shed, a space maybe about a foot wide. She somehow did this Houdini maneuver, crawled under this fence, and then crawled under this shed. And we put a camera under there and didn't see anything. But then we put a camera outside and saw her coming and going in a way that was very definitely associated with denning. And with the residents' request, we removed that female and 9 pups from under that house. So in the last 3 years, I've heard multiple cases each year of coyote dens under houses, and I can say they cause tremendous conflict among neighbors. So it's much better to keep that from happening in the first place. How would we do that? Well, I wouldn't be able to do it if it were left to me alone, but luckily I'm working with Sage Raymond, an expert tracker, one of my graduate students, and she's found over 100 den sites of coyotes in Edmonton. And what we're trying to figure out now is, well, actually, she has figured out, and she's just submitted a manuscript this week describing the characteristics of urban coyote den sites in cities, showing that what coyotes really are attracted to is quite variable at a large scale. They like to be in the river, valley, and ravine system, as you can see maybe here, but also scattered places in various natural areas or urban parks outside of the ravine system. And what they really like is dense vegetation around their den that makes them hard to see. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are far from humans. In fact, Sage found that a surprising number of these dens are very close to human dwellings and other kinds of human facilities. So this is one in South Edmonton that Sage worked up. These are all places where she found coyote scat. These are the tracks she followed to look for that. This is the coyote den site. This is the elementary school that has various field trips and nature-based activities in this patch of woods with all these coyote scats and this coyote den. And there's various backyard composts here backing on to this wooded natural area. So it's an example of the kind of sort of back to nature living that we've all been favoring for the last couple of decades, but with some unexpected and unintended kinds of risk for people. So what to do about it? Well, one way we could keep coyotes out of residential areas, I hope, is to take a page out of the book of wardens in the national parks who have been using this technique on mostly bears for at least 20 years. It's known as hazing, or more technically, aversive conditioning. They don't mean exactly the same thing, but fairly close. It's a technique that consists of harassing animals in a way that they find unpleasant, but it has to be more than just vaguely unpleasant. It has to cost them some kind of energetic cost for it to be worth their while to avoid that stimulus. So the stimulus I've dreamed up is to carry weighted tennis balls. So if you can see me in the corner of your screen, like this one, it's weighted with sand to make it the weight of a baseball. And lots of people have experience with those and can throw them quite accurately, especially with a little practice. We tie flagging tape onto them to emulate fladry. That's a centuries-old technique that has been used to keep wolves out of livestock fields. And now we have a cadre of volunteers, oh, before I leave this slide, I'll say if you're worried about coyotes, in addition to hazing them, you could carry a stick or an umbrella are two good defensive items to carry. But the nice thing about a ball that you can throw fairly accurately is that you can do this when you're a lot farther away from the coyotes, and you can get them moving away before they're so close that you would need to use a stick or any other kind of device. So what we're trying to do now in Edmonton is empower citizens to take back their neighborhoods, creating what feels like a safe space for their residents, while coexisting with coyotes that might continue to use those neighborhoods, the natural areas in them in particular, but without overlapping in close spaces with people, because they're afraid of people, because they've been subjected repeatedly to this kind of treatment where people chase them, throw things at them, shout at them, shake cans full of coins, and otherwise just harass them. So we've called this the Urban Coyote Intervention Program, and it's being wonderfully coordinated by Gabrielle Lajeunesse. And we've had some success with it already. We started this program last year, and we ran it for 3 months last year. We had over 600 patrols for coyotes conducted by residents in residential areas, 76 volunteers in 28 neighborhoods. And they had 64 observations of coyotes, but they used immersive conditioning on them only 5 times. And that's because we had treatment and control neighborhoods last year. So in the control neighborhoods, people didn't get to do this procedure. This year, everybody gets to be a treatment neighborhood. But the other reason they didn't always get to treat the coyotes is because we do this only when coyotes are exhibiting bold behavior that we want to condition. The coyotes are in a residential area during the day, and they allow people to approach within 40 meters. This is another page out of Steve Herrero's book. We use his overt reaction distance, we measure that with a little tool, and flight initiation distance. And we only treat coyotes if they are acting bold. This year, we've had even more participation already. In the last 3 weeks, we've had over 200 patrols conducted by 71 volunteers in 55 neighborhoods, with 42 observations of coyotes already and only 1 conditioning event. So my little personal dream is that we will be able to show that this works to keep coyotes wary in residential areas, and it might be adopted more broadly. In fact, Vancouver is planning to adopt it in Stanley Park, exactly this protocol, and see how it works there. And it might be a way of increasing coexistence with urban coyotes, maybe in cities across North America. I want to show you one more data slide about why I think coyotes have so much capacity to learn this kind of thing. This is more of Maureen's work, where she studied the movement of coyotes, and she studied it in particular at rush hour, which of course is quite standard throughout the year, 7 to 9 in the morning and 4 to 6 in the evening. And then she compared it to the number of road-killed coyotes. That's what these numbers are here in black. And in our study, as in most studies, there's a big peak in road-killed animals in the spring and fall. And people give that various explanations, like animals are dispersing or they're breeding. But what I think it is caused by is the overlap between crepuscular periods, dawn and dusk, and rush hour, which happens in spring and fall when we have these really large swings in the daily change in day length, like we're starting to experience now as we approach the spring equinox. So now we divided our coyotes into those that were killed in the road and those that were not killed in the road of our GPS collared animals. And what you can see is the ones that were killed were a lot more active during rush hour in the spring and fall. They continued to act like coyotes naturally do, most active at dawn and dusk. The coyotes that survived became almost completely nocturnal. They crossed roads 3 times more often than the coyotes that died, but they only did so really late at night, or they almost exclusively did so really late at night. And that nocturnality is something that's been shown in a lot of other species, including bears, as a way that animals adapt to living with people to minimize conflict. They're kind of like teenagers. That's actually an explanation given for why teenagers are so nocturnal. It's to avoid conflict with the dominant males in society. And with 3 boys in my house, I can say, yeah, I think that explanation fits. Okay, almost to the end here. One more thing you can do to protect your pets is be aware of the danger of these short fences. If you have a short fence, you might want to replace it. If you don't want to do that, you could install on it a coyote roller. This is a commercial but expensive device you can buy, or you can Google it, and there's some nice 50-ish-year-old ladies. I love this video, these comrades of mine that have this really nice do-it-yourself video on how to make coyote rollers for your backyard. So these work because coyotes jump over a fence by gaining purchase on the top of the fence and then springing off of it. And these PVC pipes on airline cables spin when they do that. So it's quite hilarious to watch what happens to dogs when they're trying to jump over a fence with a roller on it. If you have a cat, you could build a nice catio for it, which could also be a yard feature. Fladry, I mentioned that technique can be used to extend the height of any fence by just tying flagging on a rope at frequent intervals. Leashes are good ways of keeping your dog controlled when you're in natural areas, especially where coyotes might have dens. A pole is a good defensive device. And there might be a room for imagination too. So I heard a surprising number of people tell me about coyotes rushing up to their dog that was on a leash, on a trail, and biting it on the hamstring. And of course, you know that that's how coyotes and a lot of other coursing predators bring down large prey. So I've been thinking, and maybe you guys would be willing to help me test this idea, that one could get just an inexpensive piece of utility plastic coated wire, tie some flagging to the end of it, insert that into the edge of your dog's harness here. More and more people are using harnesses for their dogs, and deter coyotes from biting your dog in the hamstring. So I don't know if it would work, but I figure it's worth a try. So these are the things I think citizens can do to reduce conflict with coyotes, really control those attractants and realize how many things they comprise. Prevent exposure to parasites, especially this nasty tapeworm. Try to keep coyotes from feeling too comfortable in residential areas, and especially keep them from denning there. And protect and control pets that could otherwise be in conflict with coyotes that cost coyotes or the pets their lives. So with that, I'll just say that I think coexistence with urban coyotes is going to require that the coyotes remain wary, and they are increasingly bold among us in cities across North America, but we could change that by training them. We don't want them to be so comfortable in cities that they ride the subway. We want to push them away from their exploiter status into their adapter status, and do that with management policy and practice and citizen engagement that keeps those wily coyotes a little bit more wary. Yes, we don't want any subway riding coyotes. So with that, I'll finish. I would like to thank the many organizations that have funded this work over the years, the collaborators who have taught me so much and helped in so many ways, the core students that I mentioned earlier, and dozens of volunteers that we've had over the years, research assistants, undergraduate project students, and now many dozens of engaged citizens. I thank you all, and thanks for listening. Let's see, I'll just stop sharing that.